How do you create really vibrant discussions in class about pre-reading and reading in your discipline? In this short video for CETL's Reading for Meaning microcourse, I will describe an activity I do to build community and also get students talking about reading in class. This is adapted from facinghistory.org, an online teaching resource, and is what's called a 4Corners activity. So this is a kinesthetic classroom activity that's also easily adaptable to online to make pre-reading and reading strategies visible to students and start discussions about reading processes. Hi, my name is Dan Curtis-Cummins, and I've loved teaching first-year writing at SF State over the past 6 years. So preceding this activity, I'll share my screen. In my class and curriculum, I assign readings about reading, which I think should be done in all disciplines to make reading strategies in your discipline and for your students explicit and visible and tangible for students. You may also consider writing a short piece for students about reading in your discipline. I then also try to make discussions of reading processes really active and engaging in different ways. So as one example, my students read the online educational resource textbook that Jolie Gorgon and I created with contributions from many campus faculty. And in this textbook, chapter 1 is all about, here's the first opening page. So chapter 1 is all about diverse learning, metacognition, embracing different learning styles. And chapter 2 is all about reading strategies. I'll give you a quick look at chapter 2. And this textbook is really all about mindsets, thinking cognitively and metacognitively about how we learn and about how we think and about how we can represent and make this thinking visible through active reading and annotating. So in discussions of chapter 2, a short and simple warm-up activity that helps make pre-reading and reading processes visible for students and gets them thinking and talking about these strategies in new ways is a 4Corners activity. So you can do this in the classroom or online. Online, you might use Google Slides or another whiteboard that students can access. With either, the objective is for students to be able to show which of the 4 corners of the screen or the classroom they would go. And it sparks some choice, some engagement, and then gets some small group discussions going. So the very short and simple breakdown of this activity is, in the classroom, you write 4 different reading practices from your discipline on 4 corners of the room. So it's great if you have some paper or whiteboards for students to brainstorm on as well. So with the 4 reading practices that I wrote up, this being in week 2, were 1, skimming and scanning, 2, looking up the author, 3, writing notes on paper and or printing readings out before using hypothesis, so kind of old school annotation. And number 4, using hypothesis, which is working great for you as a student. So students have a choice to get up physically and move to different corners of the room. Ask students to move to the corner that they like or identify with most. And they can do that by indicating on screen if it's a virtual learning environment. Then in those 4 corners, when they're up and moving around a little bit and they've kind of migrated to the different corners of the room, you ask them to be sure to introduce themselves, know each other's name, ask each other how the weekend was, all right? So in a breakout, you could create a breakout room in a Zoom meeting for this. And then they discuss in that small corners, still standing up, why they chose that corner, what is working for them with that reading strategy, how they typically practice this reading strategy, etc. And by the way, all of these reading strategies are covered in the textbook. So these are things that they've read about already, and then I'm asking them to kind of dig a little deeper and make the personal connections and talk a little bit more about their personal experience with these practices. So on the whiteboard or the large sheets of paper, you ask them to brainstorm why they chose this corner, kind of summarizing their discussion in bullet points. And when we bring it back, this leads to a really fruitful discussion and clarification in a lot of instances, of various reading strategies, specifically skimming and scanning, as well as looking up the author. So I'll give you a quick description of how this went in one of my classes, which was great. Pretty typical for all three of the classes that I did this with this semester. Nobody went to look up the author. They didn't think that was an important reading strategy in the second week of college in their first year. So that was an interesting observation. So of course, that's the corner that I go into, and I make sure that I give them a little bit of a background and rationale for why I think looking up the author is important. We're not actually talking too much about credibility of authors just yet. In my class, in the first few weeks of the class, we really talk more about the importance of knowing the author so that you can make personal connections, so that you can have more of an investment, so that you can be more interested and have more of a reason to be reading this author and learning from this author. And then I also, in one class, a student brought up, well, yeah, we would need to know if the author is credible as well. And I said, yes, that's great. We're going to get to that in this semester as well. So it's also important to know a little bit about who your author is so that you know if you believe them or not. So you know if they're trustworthy as a source. So the other interesting corner was skimming and scanning. So I asked the students to share their brainstorm, share what they thought skimming and scanning was, what the difference between skimming and scanning is. And it was very interesting to be able to clarify for that corner, that little group, that skimming and scanning are both pre-reading strategies. They're not reading strategies. They don't replace diving deep and reading closely and reading carefully, reading mindfully and reading actively. That's what I tell them. So I asked the rest of the class, how do we describe skimming as a pre-reading strategy, and scanning for those bolded words, the section headings, pictures, images, and then skimming maybe the introduction, skimming the conclusion, doing a quick skim of the middle of the article or text. So it was pretty interesting to clarify those two things. I loved that in both classes, many of the students were still annotating on paper. So they liked to either print out the reading, because that's how they annotated in high school. That's how they read in high school. They're not quite used to reading on screen. So I think that's a great way to think about the transition to more online reading and using Hypothesis. And then in each class, there were at least 3 or 4 students who liked using Hypothesis. And in this class I'm thinking of specifically, the young woman loved to use it for other classes already. And this is only in week 2. Okay. So there is a second concrete activity that I hope you can adapt to your class and to your discipline that accomplishes these objectives. So it really makes reading central to the curriculum, and it helps build a community of learners through these community building activities that are centered on active reading. So it's a different approach to teaching content. It helps to rethink how to integrate content by making pre-reading and reading practices visible with these interactive classroom activities. These promote discussion about not only what they read, but how they pre-read it, how they read it, how they annotated it. Thank you, and I hope you find this activity useful.